Welcome to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, a production of The Commons, the online faith space created by the South Sound Methodist Co-op. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're a bunch of people excited to watch movies and grow together through the lens of anti-racism. I'm your host, Lauren Fontanilla, and today I'm joined by Pastor Denise Roberts from Lacey St Andrews United Methodist Church. How are you today, Pastor Denise?
I'm doing wonderful, thank you.
So today we're talking about the movie Summer of Soul. Have you seen this movie before?
I had not. This was my first viewing.
I had not either. So then do you know why it was chosen for the film club to discuss this month?
I think it was selected to some extent just because it was anticipated to be a little more lighthearted than some of the films that we have watched recently, that the music would be on the uplifting side as opposed to a dramatic plot that could get pretty deep. Yeah, and just to get a sense of the Black experience in a time period that perhaps a number of the listeners are not so familiar with, what was going on in America in 1969.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. For those who don't know, the Anti-Racist Film Club takes a break for the summer. So with you saying that it's a little bit more lighthearted, makes sense that we're ending the season, so to say, with a bang or a little bit of something joyful.
Yeah, yes, I would say that. Maybe not joyful, but certainly more on the enjoyable side as opposed as the devastating side.
Before we start talking about this film, did you want to talk any about the other films that we have selected this year? Just as a general, how did you think that the club's curriculum worked out? So we watched films like Encanto and In the Heights and Last Holiday. Till was the last time that we watched a movie all together. What did you think about this year's curriculum?
I really enjoyed it. I watched Lion. I watched Encanto, and those are both movies that I would not have typically watched. They're not in my preferred repertoire of movies, and I got a lot out of them. I got a lot out of the discussion, and that's part of the goodness of the Anti-Racist Film Club, that we get to broaden our bounds, and hopefully that's something that we take from Jesus, who was always crossing boundaries and pushing against boundaries. And even though for me, the film may be a slight little push, it's a push nonetheless. And I get to experience something that I have not allowed myself to experience before. So yeah, I think it was a healthy dose of movies from around the world, which I liked.
Yes, definitely. I feel like we had a nice variety of films this year.
Yes, I'd agree.
So for this episode, as I mentioned before, we're talking about the movie Summer of Soul, which came out just a couple years ago. So I'll read a brief description and then we can talk about this film.
Sounds good.
Summer of Soul, or When the Revolution Could Not Be Televised, is a 2021 documentary about the Harlem Cultural Festival held in 1969. Directed by Amir Questlove Thompson, Summer of Soul won an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature, a BAFTA, and a Sundance Award, among many other accolades. The Harlem Cultural Festival, held over 6 Sundays in Mount Morris Park in 1969, has been occasionally referenced as the Black Woodstock, with numerous performances by popular artists in a variety of musical styles of the day. But while over 40 hours of footage were recorded at the festival, much of it was buried in a basement for almost half a century. Summer of Soul is the first time these performances from artists like Stevie Wonder, Nina Simone, The Fifth Dimension, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Blinky Williams, and Sly and the Family Stone have ever been widely circulated to the general public. In a celebration of Black culture, art, and political history, Summer of Soul combines historical footage with commentary from modern musicians and attendees to provide context for a community of artists, both past and present. So, 54 years later, we remember the Harlem Cultural Festival and how it was almost forgotten altogether. Had you heard of the Harlem Cultural Festival before this movie?
I had not. This was all new to me.
I am in the same boat.
But it sounds like it was new to most of the nation.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a hidden little gem that was by design meant to stay hidden.
Yeah, one thing that was mentioned in the documentary is that it was very well recorded and put together, and then the footage was stored and hidden, but well preserved. The footage was very good quality, and the sound was good quality. And the main reason that was given why it wasn't widely circulated to the general public is that the public wasn't quote unquote interested in it, and so it just didn't get the promotion on any television programs of the time or sold as packages for theatrical distribution. And so the footage was archived for a very long time until it was brought back out for this film.
Yes. But at the same time, though, some of the Black talent that appeared at the film, they were in their prime. I mean, Gladys Knight had a huge hit in Midnight Train to Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And that had happened already. So to get her had to have been just a huge feat. Nina Simone was huge as well. Sly and the Family Stone, this was, they were just at the top of their game. So it's impressive who I can't remember, was it Carpenter? It's just impressive the amount of talent that he was able to bring to that period of 6 weeks. And they did it, obviously, they performed. They did a great job. I think they did a great job.
Yeah. I think that this film has a lot of the concert performances themselves. And I think that was the main feature of the documentary, is getting to see the performances and the immense talent behind the artists, exposing something that hadn't necessarily been circulated at all.
I was really drawn to the film primarily because of the music. I'm fairly familiar with at least some of the music of that time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning, I don't know if you know who Gil Scott-Heron was, but he's since died. But he was a songwriter, a poet, and he wrote quite a bit about social issues. At the beginning of this film, one of his songs, even though it's not sung, it's spoken, is called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised."
Mm-hmm.
And it plays in the beginning, and it tells you the revolution will not be televised. And what that song is about is how big business and how consumerism have made the people of our nation lazy, and not only lazy, but passive in terms of awareness of how society was changing around them.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the song, he says, "The revolution will not be televised; it will be live." And it's a great speaking song. If anybody ever wants to listen to it, I'm a big fan of Gil Scott. But he sets the stage for, I think, a number of the musicians that we see playing today. And when you listen to the music, a lot of the music has a social and political agenda. It's not a typical love song,
Mm-hmm.
It's, when I was a kid, we called it protest music. I don't know if there's a name for it now, but
if there is, I'm not particularly familiar with what it might be.
Yeah, because this music is all about what's going on in society and politics, and what's going on with our treatment of the earth. A lot of these things are wrong, and we as musicians and idealists and beautiful young people are going to call this out. And so a lot of the music is about calling out systems of power.
Mm-hmm. The film, I think, also does a very good job of taking the music and playing a little bit of the performance and then explaining the historical context of what the song is about, or events that were happening around the same time that informed the music and the performance.
Yes.
There's a few sequences in particular. I think the MLK assassination and how they wove that into the narrative of the documentary was particularly striking.
I agree. And not only this cultural festival took place over, I want to say it was 6 weekends, 6 Sundays.
Yeah, 6 consecutive Sundays, I think.
And how amazing that Woodstock was going on one of those Sundays, and the moon landing was going on another Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Just amazing that these things were happening simultaneously. Even the Vietnam War, weaving those societal priorities that were happening.
Mentioning priorities, I feel like the moon landing sequence in Summer of Soul is really interesting because they show the moon landing footage, or at least part of it, and underscored by the music playing. And then they have interview clips of people who are at the festival and asking them like, "Oh, what do you think about the fact that we just landed on the moon?" And a few different people are like, "That's great, but also there's so much more things that we could be spending money on here, that like it's such an aspiration of rich white people to travel the stars and not deal with the issues that people attending this festival want dealt with now."
Yes.
Which, I mean, is also a modern conversation. This is not an idea that's trapped in the 1960s. We see the same thing with modern tech billionaires looking for like space as the next frontier, using money that could be spent for social issues or economic like disparity.
Yeah, this was Jesus and Judas.
Yes.
That money could have been used for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And the poor were speaking up and saying exactly that. I have to say it was wonderful seeing this huge crowd of so many Black people, because that's not something that I get to see, and my heart was at home, and so many young people. And you weren't hearing about fights, and you weren't hearing about violence. People were just there. Somebody in the film commented that, yeah, people bring their fried chicken and lemonade or whatever drinks they want to bring and just kind of sit down and have a picnic and enjoy the music. That touched my heart because that's how I grew up.
Mm-hmm. I think at one point they mentioned that over the 6 weeks there are about 300,000 attendees.
Mm-hmm.
That is massive for I know I don't have the exact layout of New York City memorized, but it seems like that is a lot of people to have in around a park in Harlem.
Yeah, I was surprised in the conversation about the police. They had gotten approval to do the concert, and first of all, to me, it was a surprise that the police got to say no, they weren't going to provide security. I didn't know police could say no to a crowd of 40 or 50,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
And so they provided their own security using the Black Panthers,
mm-hmm.
which was kind of interesting. But they did every once in a while have clips that they showed that there were at least some kind of police presence there.
Yeah, and I wonder if that was a difference between weeks. Like maybe the first week the New York City police refused, and then as the festival continued to go on over the summer, maybe that changed. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, over 6 weeks, that makes sense.
I do know that I was watching an interview clip with Questlove where he talked about the way that the festival came into be. I don't know if this made it into the actual cut of the film, but the idea is that because this was a year after the assassination of MLK, there was a lot of riots and protests around the country. And so approaching the heat of the summer, literal heat, that it was going to be a time where they wanted specifically to occupy people so that there wouldn't be civil unrest. And so that's why this festival was supported by the New York government, and why like the mayor of New York City, or maybe it was the governor of New York State, one of the two, was in attendance at the festival and up on stage and giving full support. Was that it was a way to occupy people so they didn't have the free time to riot in their minds.
It's certainly possible the Black community just across the nation was coming off of the 60s were a tough decade. We lost Malcolm, we lost Medgar, we lost Martin, we lost JFK and Bobby Kennedy. So there were a lot of deaths. It was a decade of Good Friday. And this was, there was some imagery there of Palm Sunday, that this is a celebration, and it was sorely needed. So I can certainly see that part of the celebration was to soothe a bunch of wounded souls and to hopefully, as you say, not have them riot, not have them demonstrate their hurt in counterproductive ways.
Mm-hmm. At another point in that interview, Questlove talked about how while the film was being edited in 2020, there were certain times where things on the news mirrored so heavily the historical footage that was being edited that it was hard to tell where the present was bleeding into the past. And that a lot of the lessons that the nation attempted to learn in the 60s were not learned, and that a lot of the social issues and the ways that they were indicated have not changed at all.
Yeah, but it's not surprising that they haven't changed because there has been no political will to change them.
Mm-hmm.
It continues to be very easy to say, oh, that's just the Black community. They're going to do what they're going to do, and pretend that it's not going to escape from the Black community, that people who are hurt and people who have harm done to them are going to be content just hurting. Generally, that's not what happens. And there's a lot of history to show that's not what happens.
Mm-hmm.
But we do live in a nation that opens its eyes to the hurt of some and closes its eyes to the hurt of others. That has not changed. That was going on way before the 60s.
What else in this film did you find particularly interesting or that you would want to talk about?
This was I guess it was interesting. But again, the 6 weeks of concerts. And so one of the weeks, I don't know what they called it, but it was the gospel music Sunday, which was just so interesting because I just can't even imagine that now. Do you know if some of the biggest entertainers in the U.S. did concerts for 6 Sundays in a row? I just can't imagine that one of those 6 lineups would include gospel music.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I'm being cynical. I think I'm being real, but I don't think I'm being cynical. But I just thought, oh, that was just wonderful then.
Yeah, they had a lot of variety in the music. I think more than I realized that there was in the 60s. I don't know if this is just modern ears not being educated in music history, but like I would have described a lot of these songs that I had heard before and that the way that they're used in pop culture now, I would have said they were all part of the same category of quote unquote soul music. And this was an education point for me, learning that soul music is a lot bigger than I thought it was and incorporated way more artists and influences than I had ever considered before.
I don't know what the music industry was like. I mean, in terms of how it was organized and managed. But I do remember that when I was a kid on what we would have called then Top 40 radio, I would hear songs from people in Africa, which never happens now.
Mm-hmm.
But I would hear Miriam Makeba, who would have a hit in Kenya, and they'd be blasting it on Baltimore, and I'd hear it a lot more than once. I would hear all kinds of songs from Latin America, and some of that is what I think was present in the concert.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess now music has been pigeonholed to the extent that those other voices, now it's kind of Latin music, and you'll only hear it on a Latin music station.
Mm-hmm.
Indie music, and you'll only hear it on an indie music station. But when I was a kid, it was all together. You would hear Simon and Garfunkel, and then you would hear something from somewhere in Ghana, and not think anything about it because the radio, it seemed to be whatever record was placed in front of them, they would play.
I mean, that's interesting thinking about how it was a more global music scene in the 60s than now. Because I agree with you that I think that is the pattern that I would say that I've noticed too. But with the internet and having more access to sharing from artists not only around the world, but also who aren't necessarily signed with record companies, you would think that music would be more global now, but I agree with you. I don't think it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's global, but it's very specific. You can get what you want.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a pull system. You can pull what you want. And then, of course, in the 60s, it was all a push system. It was what the radio stations would play, but they would play a little bit of everything. And I think I kind of miss some of that. One of the things that really touched me was the end of the film, and they showed a few shots of the empty park.
Mm-hmm.
There was just, litter on the ground, and that was it. And this past Sunday, I preached about the walk to Emmaus.
Mm-hmm.
In the walk to Emmaus, you picture the people leaving Jerusalem and going back home, and how downhearted they are, because they just thought this, in their time in Jerusalem, they had experienced the biggest thing in their lives. They had a chance to get up close and personal with Jesus, and then they experienced the worst moment in their lives. And so now they were leaving, and at this festival, I think there was just such a high being there, because they were all looking around and seeing all of these people that look like them, and everybody's treating one another well, and the music is speaking to their hearts and to their souls, and it's calling out the ills of the world, and it's lifting up the joys of the Black community. And this is at a time when Black people kind of changed our name from being called colored to being called Black. And I just remember so much of that. I remember Sly and the Family Stone. When I was in, I don't know, first or second grade, they had a hit song called Everybody is a Star. And that was our class song when I was in, I think, second grade. Everybody is a star, because every societal influence around us, every single one told us we were not stars. They told us we were bad and terrible, horrible, and awful, and we were going to all end up in prison. And so his song was the antithesis of typical society.
Mm-hmm.
I think as the people were leaving, I think there was some shock that they had seen the best, and they were walking along, and they were probably saying things like, we had hoped something would come of this. And I think they were wondering and uncertain. Were they going to come off of those wonderful 6 Sundays and just go back into a society that hadn't changed one bit, the same old, or were some things going to change?
We could talk a little bit more about the way that this festival didn't really have massive cultural impact on history. It's a little bit of a disappointing ending, because folks did walk away from the 6 weeks. And in a way, it's as if the popular white culture did forget about it, and forgot on purpose.
Actually, I don't even think they forgot. I think the intent was to pay as little attention as possible, to give these Black folks a space so they could do their thing and get it out of their systems. And it's kind of like what you were saying earlier, to appease the savage beast in them. But I don't think there was any intention to ever do it much more than that.
I know this film went through a name change at one point. Early on, it was initially going to be called Black Woodstock, as sort of a reverse cultural appropriation, where so many times white culture takes the name of something or something from Black culture and then appropriates it and makes it their own. So I know the filmmakers were contemplating taking Woodstock, this massive majority white cultural touch base, and then putting their, in the words of the director Questlove, putting their stain on it to like have satire on the cultural relevance of Woodstock. And they eventually decided not to do that, because they felt that it was playing into the stereotype of Black culture being a mark on something else, whereas this event was its own. It wasn't a Black Woodstock. This came first for the most part. Like, this was happening, and it started before Woodstock in 1969. But it also was its own thing. It didn't need to be defined by something else.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's so unfortunate that it has never gotten the airplay that it deserves. And comparing it to Woodstock, it's just amazing how these two festivals were treated so differently, so incredibly differently.
Mm-hmm.
But it's won an Oscar, so that's a good. It's won actually. it's won a large number of awards, and so 54 years after the fact, that's I'm appreciative of that recognition. And like I said, it did bring joy to my heart to see this huge crowd. This was a huge crowd in a tiny little, well, not tiny, but still not a large space. I know that the park has been renamed. I can't remember.
I don't remember what the new name is either.
I'm curious, though, as to why in 54 years it hasn't been done again.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, yeah, just not the time. Not yet the time. I'll put the yet in there because I'm that person who believes Easter is always coming. In those times when I feel like I'm living in Good Friday, Easter is always coming.
If there's one main takeaway from the film that you want people to have or to consider, what do you think this documentary really has to say and leave with its audience?
Wow, you end with a tough question, and I say that because if you're coming with some sense of what was going on in the 60s, then I think you can leave with the idea that music was making a move. Those creative juices were flowing to make people better, to make society better, to make the world better. That was coming out of the Black community. But you kind of have to know there were problems in the nation and in the community to have that takeaway. And if you're coming just cold, then you can appreciate it as music that you like or perhaps even don't like. I think you would miss the whole sense that music has the ability to change hearts. Music has the ability to change minds. It's not just something to be enjoyed. Music can push us to behave in different ways. So I guess the experience that you take away from the film is going to rely somewhat on what you're bringing into the viewing. Probably more than you wanted to hear on that question.
Nope, that was the perfect amount. Thank you for listening to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast. If you haven't seen Summer of Soul, it is currently available to stream on both Disney Plus and Hulu, and probably a few other places, probably available to rent also. To learn more about the Anti-Racist Film Club itself, visit fumcoli.org or follow the links in our description below. This is a monthly podcast, so be sure to follow us on whatever platform you're currently listening to, such as Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Music, so you don't miss our next upload. Because the Anti-Racist Film Club itself and our monthly meetings are taking a break for the summer, so we'll not be meeting in June, July, or August. The podcast might also go on hiatus, but keep a watch on your inbox just in case we have a few fun bonus episodes over the summer. But before we sign off today, I want to thank you, Pastor Denise, for leading our conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And for everyone who tuned into our discussion, thanks for listening.